Hello, so today I thought I would share a story which I have mentioned before, and one that I find really fascinating, and it's centred somewhere out near Yass. I've forgotten the name of the property, but I'm going to look it up when it comes up again. It's a story of a murder that happened in 1876. I've heard the place called the Washpin or the Washpan, and I think it's a space on a creek that it looks like a pen where you wash cattle, like you wash your bullocks down, maybe. So this is from the Brennan book. That's also in John Gale book, but I like this version. It has a little more detail. So let's get straight into it. The Washpin Murder, a thrilling psychological adventure. I won't worry about the quote. He's full of quotes, this Brennan guy. It drives me a bit crazy. Of the many ferocious crimes committed in New South Wales during the last 50 years, probably there was not one governed by more extraordinary surroundings than the notorious Washpin Murder of 1876. I, that is Martin Brennan, was in charge of the Queanbeyan and District Police that year, which was an exceptionally dry one, and memorable for the devastation wrought through a prolonged and appalling drought. There was no grass whatever to be seen, the waterholes and creeks were dried up, and as a consequence almost all the cattle running at large in the bush perished. In those days they didn't have a lot of fences, so a lot of the cattle were just left to run, and the shepherds would go out and keep them. On the 28th of June 1876, I received intimation that a shepherd named McCarthy was murdered on the Murrumbidgee River at Queanbeyan, that's the place, a locality situated in the boundary of the Queanbeyan and Yass districts. Queanbeyan, Y-U-M-B-R-A. I'll keep that for later. I met by arrangement Inspector Brennan. Oh, actually, this is the rewrite version because it mentions meeting Inspector Brennan. So this is John Gale's version, which is based on Brennan's report. Anyway. Two troopers, the coroner and the jury from Yass at the scene of the outrage, where an inquest was forthwith held when a verdict of wilful murder was returned against some person or persons to the jury unknown. The body of the unfortunate victim was then buried beside his log cabin. And close to the Murrumbidgee River. The Yass police and myself set ourselves vigorously to work to unravel the mystery. We discovered in a dry creek close by 2 distinct tracks of boots. One larger than the other, and singular to relate, were made by 2 left-foot boots. These impressions we traced for several miles towards the residence of Mr. Davis, whose servant the shepherd was. Mr. Davis informed us he suspected the notorious Tom Robinson, alias Tom the Soldier, alias Waterloo Tom, as being the perpetrator of the horrible crime, and said the night before the murder he found the ruffian in his kitchen at a late hour and gave him a shakedown. That he had in his possession a rifle-bore gun, the barrel of which was nearly 6 feet long and which he called Long Tom. That he inquired if the shepherd McCarthy was still at the wash pen, and that the following morning he could find no trace of the fiend, who had cleared out during the early hours, taking with him a blanket, a left-foot boot, and a canister of strychnine. It was clear, therefore, from what we had observed at the washpen, and from what Mr. Davis told us, that the offender reached the shepherd's hut late at night, had supper with the shepherd, who afterwards sat on a log outside, when the murderer discharged the contents of his gun into his head, removed half the skull with a sharp instrument, and then partly concealed the body in some scrub. We discovered the missing portion of the skull beneath a log, and found in the brain therein 32 pieces of lead. The deed was a brutal one, and not executed on the refined principle which governed De Quincey's murder as a fine art. The inside of the cabin was in a disordered state. Several religious books, which doubtless the poor shepherd was in the habit of reading, lay beside his improvised bed. The flour and sugar bags had been tampered with, and in the former we found the strychnine canister nearly empty. 3 opossums, which is the ringtail possum, the common one, lay asleep in the fireplace, while the meat bag was occupied by an enormous iguana, presumably a goanna, and the traces of the destructive ghoul abounded on all sides. The deceased was a young man of irreproachable character, who had been in Mr. Davis's employment for some time as shepherd, the duty of which at this particular juncture was no easy task, as the sheep had to be constantly on the move over the rugged hills and defiles of the run, and were kept alive principally on the branches of trees and undergrowth daily cut for their sustenance by their faithful attendant. The locality of the murder was known as the Washpin, a small area of semicircular form fronting the noble river and surrounded for the most part by precipitous, barren ranges of volcanic formation. There were no homesteads within miles of the picturesque but wild tract of the Washpin, wherein the lonely shepherd dwelt, hence his desolate position at night. When darkness enveloped the weird surroundings of his solitude can hardly be imagined. What with the rustling of snakes, iguanas and lizards, the plaintive wails of the curlews, the caw-cawing of the laughing jackass, the shrill yelping of dingoes surrounding the sheepfold, the chatter of opossums rushing incessantly over his hut, the occupant, with justice, might well exclaim in the language of the poet, "O solitude, where are the charms that sages have seen in thy face? Better dwell in the midst of alarms than reign in this horrible place." It was clear that Tom the soldier was the murderer, and to compass his capture was now our aim and object. He was an old Vandemonian, transported in his youth from England for a serious offence. While serving his time in Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, he frequented the Aborigine camps and endeavoured by main force to carry off a young gin, female Aboriginal. He failed, however, in his purpose, and in the melee which ensued, lost an eye from the stroke of a nulla, and got severely wounded in the knee from a boomerang. After remission or expiration of his sentence, he migrated to sunny New South Wales, where he had ample scope for his villainous proclivities. He was of colossal stature, about 6 feet 4 in height, ungainly figure, large flapping ears, long straggling beard and whiskers, with a murderous expression of countenance, not unlike that which characterised the features of the notorious bushranger Morgan. He was a cunning, vindictive and unscrupulous man, and a smiling, destructive criminal. While in New South Wales he followed no occupation, moved about as a tramp in the Goulburn, Yass and Queanbeyan districts, invariably carried a long gun and a formidable sheath knife made from the point of a scythe, lived on birds, possums and kangaroos, camped in hollow trees and logs in the daytime, and prowled about at night when he purloined edibles from the huts and dwellings of shepherds and settlers. He posed as a hero who had shot thousands in his time, and asserted that the wounds he bore were received in the famous Battle of Waterloo. Hence it was he received the sympathy of the credulous, while many of the settlers were afraid of him, but as nothing of a serious character could be established against him, he was permitted to continue his nomadic way of life. The police spared no exertion, night or day, to capture him, but all to no purpose, as no person had seen or heard of him. On the afternoon of the 5th day's search, Trooper McIntosh and myself discovered the ghoul's lair in a hollow log near Duntroon, and while searching about, observed smoke from a campfire in the distance, near the Queanbeyan River. Thither we cantered, and on reaching the slip rails of a paddock fence, saw a gunya beside a large tree. I think a gunya is a lean-to, isn't it? 400 yards in front of us, with a small fire beside it. McIntosh alighted to remove the slip rails, when all of a sudden we heard the loud discharge of a gun, and simultaneously the rails were splintered beside us from the impact of leaden bullets. We grasped the situation in a moment and promptly raced down on the gunya with arms in readiness, just in time to prevent a second discharge from Long Tom, which doubtless would have proved fatal to one of us. The murderer was disarmed after a severe struggle and handcuffed. On being asked why he wanted to shoot us, he naively replied with a sarcastic grin, "You know I've been a soldier and shot thousands in many battles. I've got into that way now that when I see a man passing I cannot resist making a target of him. And, my friends, if I only could have got my gun caps in time, one of you would be in a position to say, 'What a good shot Waterloo Tom is.'" He was wearing left feet boots and had in his possession a sheath knife, a bag of bullets, powder, caps, etc., as well as new blankets and wearing apparel taken from his victim. The Waterloo hero was lodged in the Queanbeyan jail that evening, and his capture gave unqualified satisfaction to the residents of the surrounding districts. In preparing the evidence in the case, I found it would be indispensable to reopen the shepherd's grave at the Washpin in order to secure the blankets placed there with the body, one being the property of the murderer, and the other being that stolen by him from Mr. Davis. Inspector Brennan and a trooper from Yass met Trooper McIntosh and myself the next day, when we procured a pick and shovel at the residence of Mr. Charles Hall, JP, and then proceeded to the Washpen, where we arrived at 2 p.m, unconscious that we were destined for a thrilling experience. It was a beautiful clear day. Everything seemed still in the locality save the she-oaks, which abounded along the banks of the then low and placid river, which gave out doleful murmurs to the slightest zephyr. The sun's rays shone along the serpentine windings of the river, but this was changed in a brief space, as scarcely had we stood beside the grave when an extraordinary cumulostratus cloud, or woolpack, descended and enveloped the mountains and the Washpin in comparative darkness. We commenced the work of exhumation, and just as the spade had touched a timber slab which rested on the body, the sound of a terrific explosion took place. The ground trembled and seemed to sink beneath our feet, as if from the impact of a monster thunderbolt or aerolite hurled by Jupiter, father of the gods and men, against our planet. And a rumbling sound of great volume reverberated through the valley for some seconds. Before we had recovered ourselves, however, from this appalling experience, a roar was heard from the mountain top above us, which was intensified by repetitions along the valley of the great river, when suddenly we observed through the gloom a huge bull of immaculate whiteness rushing down the declivity towards us. We promptly sought the protection of trees close by, drew revolvers, and stood in readiness for defence, but this was unnecessary, as the animal, on reaching the open grave, stopped suddenly and with head erect, surveyed the surroundings, pawed the earth for a few seconds, then lay beside the grave, moaned piteously, and expired. Whence doth that murmur wake, that shadow fall? Why shakes the spirit thus? 'Tis mystery all. Sounds like Shakespeare, I don't know. After assuring ourselves that the strange animal was dead, we, without making any observations on the extraordinary occurrences witnessed, hastily completed our task, departed, and camped in a gully a mile distant and close to the river that night. When we discussed the matter somewhat reservedly and endeavoured to explain the cause, we had not, however, seen such an animal in the district or in our experience, and under the conditions of drought which prevailed, were convinced it was no man's property. I remarked that its marvellous symmetry and whiteness realized the ideal of the white heifers which the devotees of the goddess Venus offered as sacrifices on her altars in the temple of Pharos in Cyprus. There are not many persons in Australia who have an adequate conception of the lonely, monotonous and miserable lives which shepherds in the Australian wilds have had to endure in the performance of their duties. Even 30 years ago, camped in humpies or gunyahs miles away from their stations or settled habitation, their only companion being a faithful sheepdog, their rations scanty and rough, and their every movement imperilled by the serpents of the forest, which on occasions claimed occupancy of their gunyahs. Some of these old veterans have been found dead in the bush from snake bites, others taken up for insanity and sent to asylums, while others again, like the unfortunate McCarthy, have been found foully murdered by some criminal tramp for the few articles of clothing they possessed. The position of the shepherd at present is different from that of 30 years ago, and the work is now done principally by boundary riders, as the runs are, to a great extent, fenced. After experiencing a very unpleasant night in the camp, being worried by native dingoes, we started at early dawn and returned to our respective stations. 2 days subsequently, I sent Trooper McIntosh to bury the poison flour and sugar, and to take an inventory of the deceased's effects for the curator of intestate estates, and while proceeding to the washpen, he was joined by Mr. Davis, who accompanied him thither, being anxious to see the extraordinary white bull he heard so much about. But lo, on arriving there, not a vestige of the animal could be found. I am well aware that assertions regarding ghosts, apparitions, and mysterious manifestations create a smile, and the parties who allege they have seen or experienced them are looked upon by self-constituted wiseacres as weak-minded, silly, and superstitious ignoramuses, whose movements required strict surveillance. Be that as it may, there are few, however, I think, who will have the temerity to doubt that apparitions have from time to time immemorial been seen, and supernatural occurrences observed, which have baffled the most eminent psychologists to satisfactorily explain. In the present case, I merely describe what 4 police officers in perfect health and with all their faculties unimpaired saw and carefully observed in the daytime, and which, after many years' service in the police force, they were unable to account for. Hence they regarded the occurrence as a psychological phenomenon. Prosecution of the Waterloo hero. At this time, the inhabitants of the beautiful town and district of Queanbeyan had as their chief magistrate a gentleman of commanding appearance and military caste, who possessed some sterling qualities which were, however, marred by his occasional supercilious mannerisms toward the profanum vulgus, which he used to politely term the ordinary residents, forgetting that, of all the causes which conspire to blind man's erring judgment and misguide the mind, what the weak head and the strongest bias rules is pride, the never-failing vice of fools. He had many years' experience in the colony as a military officer, and on his retirement applied for and was permitted to assume the honorary rank of lieutenant colonel. As police magistrate, he proved a staunch friend to the unfortunates brought before him who posed as old soldiers, and not infrequently found them not guilty, even when they pleaded otherwise. On the day of the police court proceedings, the lieutenant colonel took his seat on the bench at 10 a.m. and was joined by the senior honorary magistrate, a capable and fearless justice. The court was crowded, the district being largely represented. After giving a brief outline of the murder and the evidence to be adduced in support of the capital charge, I stepped into the witness box, but before being sworn in, the lieutenant colonel said, "Pardon me for a moment." He took the charge sheet in his left hand, placed an eyeglass in front of his right orb, and read aloud, "Thomas Robinson, alias Tom the Soldier, alias Waterloo Tom. You are charged with the wilful murder of Jeremiah McCarthy," then looked at the prisoner, who seemed equal to the occasion, and gave him an unmistakable military salute. "Ah, by gad, I see you've been a soldier." Sounds like Major Bloodknock. "Yes, Colonel," replied the Waterloo hero. "I have fought and bled in many great battles." "I thought so," returned his worship. "What battles, may I ask, were they?" All through the Peninsular War, Colonel." "Indeed. Did you know the great hero, Sir John Moore?" "Know him, Colonel? Why, it was I who buried him. I well remember the night." "Well, well. Did you know the great Duke of Wellington, better known as the Iron Duke?" continued the Colonel. "Yes, Colonel. He was a warm friend of mine, and he acknowledged to myself that it was I who actually won the Battle of Waterloo." What? How could he say so?" Well, I was engaged in the front rank of the attacking regiment when a cannonball killed scores around me. Pieces of iron flew around me as thick as hail. One piece knocked my eye out, and another injured my knee. This took place as the great Napoleon himself was starting off the field. When seeing so many killed, he halted and was about to commence again, when I raised my gun and fired straight at him, and the ball struck the plume on his helmet. Napoleon said something to an officer beside him, looked at me, and then cleared off the field, and the Battle of Waterloo was won. Blücher came up shortly afterwards and inquired for the hero of Waterloo, shook hands with me and said I ought to be a general, or at least a colonel. At this stage, I protested on the ground that the charge was of too much gravity to permit of the court proceedings being turned into a farcical episode. Why, said the chief magistrate, do you say so? Because I know the prisoner is telling untruths. As you will observe by the charge sheet, he is but 60 years of age. Consequently, the battles he refers to took place before he was born. Proceed with your evidence, said the senior honorary magistrate. At the conclusion of the evidence for the prosecution, Waterloo Tom was committed for trial to the Queanbeyan Circuit Court, to be holden on the 9th of October. The evening preceding the trial, Queanbeyan was crowded with persons interested in the criminal court proceedings. I put up at Mr. Thomas's splendid hostelry, where I met the present Honourable R.E. O'Connor QC, a personal friend who was then a young barrister on the Southern Circuit. He had read of the murder case in which I was officially engaged, and was desirous of knowing all the particulars so as to be prepared to defend the prisoner, if asked by the presiding judge. There were few, if indeed any, barristers at the time who were entitled to more consideration at the hands of the police than Mr. O'Connor, and consequently I gave him all the particulars, even including the prisoner's own history, remarking as I did so that his so-called Waterloo exploits would furnish a splendid theme for his forensic peroration. On the following day, the business of the court commenced at 10 a.m. The court and surroundings were thronged with jurors, witnesses, and the general public. The calendar was a very heavy one, and represented serious crime of every kind. Sir William Manning, I think, presided, and Mr. Davis, an able barrister, prosecuted for the Crown. After a couple of prisoners had pleaded guilty, Thomas Robinson, alias Tom the Soldier, alias Waterloo Tom, was indicted, and called on by the clerk of arraign to plead. The prisoner stood to attention, looked towards the judge, whom he saluted, and said in a distinct voice, "Not guilty, Your Honour," knowing full well that while his tongue the charge denied, his conscience knew 'twas true. The judge, having ascertained from the Crown prosecutor that the prisoner was not defended, asked Mr. O'Connor if he would undertake the defence. Mr. O'Connor replied, "Yes, Your Honour." "How long will you require?" continued the judge. 5 minutes, answered the young barrister. Judge: "Thank you, Mr. O'Connor. Let the case proceed." Mr. O'Connor and Solicitor Davidson left the court for a few minutes, and on their return the case proceeded. The learned counsel asked very few questions of the witnesses in cross-examination. Nevertheless, he elicited the important fact that the prisoner was known as Mad Tom the Soldier. At the conclusion of the case for the Crown, it was intimated that the prisoner had no witnesses to call. In his address to the jury, Mr. O'Connor said, "Gentlemen, I have undertaken a grave responsibility in this case, and need scarcely point out that yours is still graver, because you are now constituted before God and man, the judges, as to whether the prisoner at the bar did or did not, with malice aforethought, commit the crime laid to his charge. That a terrible murder, which we all deplore, has been committed by some person there can be no doubt. It is assumed and placed before you that by the Crown that Tom the Soldier perpetrated the deed, that he went to the Washpin that night to see the shepherd, that he partook of his hospitality, that he shot him through the head, removed a portion of it in a barbarous fashion, and then distributed a canister of strychnine poisoning through the flour, tea and sugar in the dead man's hut, and that his motive was to become possessed of a few articles of clothing. If that were the motive, what object, I ask you, was there in mutilating the dead man's body? Or what motive was there in distributing strychnine in the flour, tea and sugar in the hut after the murder of the poor shepherd? Gentlemen, British law provides the death penalty for murder, and His Honour will tell you that you have nothing to do with that, as your duty is confined solely to the question as to whether the prisoner is guilty or not. I would have thought that the psychological conditions disclosed in this remarkable case would have suggested to the Crown the absolute necessity of having the mental condition of the prisoner carefully inquired into by medical experts. As the Crown asserted his wickedness, it was in duty bound to show his responsibility. Gentlemen of the jury, look carefully in the prisoner in the dock, and note his appearance. It was given in evidence that he led an extraordinary life for many years, that he had no place of settled habitation, that he slept in hollow logs and wombat holes, supported himself like a primitive savage on possums and other wild animals, was in fact the wild man of the forest, and bore the appropriate name of Mad Tom the Soldier. Can you, as sensible men, say with truth that Tom the Soldier is in a condition of mind to be responsible for his actions? I certainly do not think so. Assuming for argument's sake that he committed the crime laid to his charge, and that his conviction should follow, still the Crown would not be justified in inflicting a death penalty when such unmistakable evidence of his insanity exists. Who can draw the line of demarcation where sanity ceases and infatuity begins in any person? No one can do so, no more than... no more than he could tell what insanity is traceable. Medical science, even less than 100 years ago, regarded insanity as a disease of the soul, and it is very doubtful if the medical profession of the present day can satisfactorily diagnose it. Nevertheless, it was the bounden duty of the Crown to have assisted you in arriving at a verdict with a safe conscience, by placing before you the opinions of at least 2 medical men as to whether the unfortunate man, whose life is placed in your hands, is compos or non-compos mentis. Having dealt at length with the psychological aspect of the case, Mr. O'Connor turned his attention to the actual evidence in support of the charge. He summarised the facts accurately, and laid bare the weak points, quoted parallel cases from O'Connell's recollections of the bar, the Hounslow Heath murders, etc., to show that persons had been consigned by the verdicts of juries to an irrevocable doom on what seemed unmistakable chain evidence of guilt, whereas it was subsequently established beyond all possibility of doubt that the so-called murderers were innocent, the real culprits or criminals having confessed and explained their adroitness in confixing guilt on innocent people. The jury had before them charged with a terrible crime, wilful murder, an old man on the verge of the grave, suffering from wounds and senile decay, who, if he had common justice done him for the noble services he rendered on behalf of his country, would now be in receipt of a pension adequate to his maintenance. The prisoner in the days of his youth, before the gentlemen of the jury were born, rendered important and heroic service in fighting our battles against an insatiable usurper who was bent on the subjugation of the European powers for his own aggrandisement. The remarkable man, designated by the poet Byron, that modern mightier far, who, born no king, made monarchs draw his car. Yes, Tom the Soldier distinguished himself signally at the famous Battle of Waterloo, and was instrumental as far as he could in adding a halo of military glory to British arms and prowess. The life of this Waterloo hero was now a matter for their bravest consideration, and it behoved them, as sensible men of the world, to weigh carefully every circumstance placed before them in this extraordinary case, and unless they felt thoroughly convinced of his guilt and his responsibility at the time, beyond all reasonable doubt, they should return the talismanic verdict of not guilty. The address, of over an hour's duration, was listened to with rapt attention, and at its conclusion he was heartily congratulated by his friend, the Honourable John Want, QC, the veritable Varro of the Australian criminal bar, and by many others. The judge, in summing up the case for the jury, complimented Mr. O'Connor for his eloquent and powerful defence, and augured for that gentleman a brilliant career at the bar. The jury, after a brief retirement, found the prisoner guilty of murder. The Waterloo hero, on being asked by the clerk of arraigns if he had anything to say why sentence of death should not be passed upon him, he replied, "Yes, Your Honour, I don't want to die, and I don't believe I ought to die after all the service I have done for the country." Tom the soldier was sentenced to death, but through the instrumentality of Mr. O'Connor and the others, the Executive Council commuted the sentence to imprisonment for life. Life, I profane the word. Can those be said to live who merit death? No, they are dead. The murderer, however, lived, to use a Hibernianism, all the days of his life, while the shepherd, his victim, was hurled into an irrevocable doom without pity or consideration. Tom the soldier was a brutal type of criminal, who, in the days of the essayist Sidney Smith, would have been hanged, but he was fortunate in living in a less rigorous time, when the law was purged of its draconian severity. His antics in prison from the date of his reprieve to his death disclosed a mind assailed by fear, alarm, and remorse. He did not realize or appreciate the privilege of being saved from the gallows. On the contrary, he raved at the supposed excessive torture he was subjected to by armed criminals who had conspired to murder him. He fancied he could see in every crevice during the day extraordinary fiends, and at night he had no repose in his efforts to escape the punishment which he alleged two females, each of whom claimed to be his wife, inflicted upon him. The misdeeds of his past life crowded upon him. They were written upon every object he beheld, and so wretched did he become in body and mind that he, in a fit of wild desperation, made a determined effort to put an end to his miserable existence. From my experience of criminals during a long police service, I am convinced there is probably no greater punishment of wickedness than it is dissatisfied with itself and its deeds, and this view of the question is eloquently and powerfully expressed by Lucretius in his definition of a guilty conscience. Cerberus, the Furies even, black hell, belching forth horrible flames from its jaws, these are mere fancies, mere empty names. But in this life the fear of pains for wicked deeds is felt most acutely. The prison, the fearful fall of the rock, scourges, the executioners, the pitch, the wheel, the torch, these affright the mind. Yet, though these be not present, the guilty mind, anticipating evils, scourges and stings itself, nor does it meanwhile see what can be the termination or the end of its punishments, fearing lest they should be fiercer after death. Hence the life of such fools is as wretched as it would be in the realms of Pluto. The pseudo-hero terminated his earthly career many years ago, and was buried unhonoured and unsung, to wait the hour when all that are in the graves shall come forth and obtain their eternal rewards, they that have done good unto the resurrection of life. So that's quite a story, and one that I'm very fascinated about on many levels. I did find out where that property is. It's out between Queanbeyan and Yass. There's a spot on the river. I'd like to see it one day, just for the hell of it. But I'm really puzzled about the white bull. A pure white bull appearing out of nowhere, dying on the spot of the shepherd's grave, is in an unusual thunderstorm. That is just a bizarre event. And these people who are reporting this, I think they're completely credible. John Gale is a highly respected journalist and one of the founders of modern Queanbeyan and Canberra. In fact, he was a very strong proponent of Canberra as a location for the capital and published, because he had a print shop in Queanbeyan, he published a brochure very strongly encouraging Canberra, the Limestone Plains, as the site for Canberra and the capital. And according to some people, that was very instrumental in Canberra actually becoming the capital. And Martin Brennan, who wrote the original account, seems to be a religious man, a very honourable policeman in a very difficult job, and I think they're completely reliable, so it's all in all a fascinating story. So anyway, I'll end that there and see what else I can find to read.